Hi, welcome to How to RPG. My name is Fred Weller and today I want to talk about designing your own mine or mines for your role-playing games. So this is part of running adventures for the Game Master. This is Game Master guidance or a guide, and I'm hoping this will be useful to you. I'm going to go through fairly quickly some of the basics around the mine. So there are certain aspects to a mine that are built and created. So the first thing is you have the thing at the very top. That is called the mine head frame. The mine head frame is built like a A-frame or A structure, and it's used with a winch or a hoist of some type, and it's operated along the main vertical mine shaft. This is what lowers things and lifts, bring things to the surface. So whether that's personnel or people or resources or the actual mining ore, that's what it's used for. It's basically the head frame for a lift. Passenger or cargo lifts can often be connected to the same head frame. So they may be exactly the same lift, but quite often there is a separate lift for the passengers going up and down and for the cargo, but they will be using the same shaft. The winch in the head frame can be powered a few different ways, such as a mechanical crank that you simply turn by hand. It could be a steam engine, you could use a counterweight, you could use magic. You may even have a team of horses or animals that pull the cable that allows it to go up and down, and it's as simple as that. Next we have the mine shafts. So there are actually three different types of mine shaft. They serve different purposes or have multiple purposes to them. The first one is the bell-shaped mine, and this is the one I'm going to talk about the most. It's essentially, it looks like a bell. If you put it under the ground, that's the shape of it. It starts very narrow at the top and widens out as you go deeper and deeper and deeper. And then you have the vertical shaft, which is basically just a shaft that goes up and down. And then you have open mining, which is not very exciting for a role-playing game because it's just a great huge hole in the ground, but very safe in terms of mining. The main mine shaft transports your ore, your minerals, dirt, rock, anything that they dig up from below the ground. It brings it to the surface, and it also, as I said, acts as a way of transporting your workers or your passengers up and down, but it also allows for air to be moved up and down through the actual mine. So it's like its own air vent in many respects. So air ventilation shafts can also be dug, additional ones, vertically into the mine, and they can be spread out throughout the mine so you can feed air to various places. Now the reason for doing this is to avoid toxic or flammable gases building up, and you want to be able to bring oxygen into the mine because it's quite difficult to shift those gases out of the air and replace them with oxygen that you can actually breathe. So there's a rationale behind that. Sometimes you'll find a horizontal tunnel will act as the main entrance to a mine, and then it leads into the complex, and usually it will be connected to a main vertical shaft leading downward rather than continuing horizontally into the mountain. Now, mine levels. The mine will consist of horizontal tunnels, usually coming off the main vertical shaft, and then you have sort of a string. They can go left and right if you're using a bell. If you're using a different system such as just a vertical shaft, then it might not be in a bell shape. It depends on where the ore is. You don't necessarily just dig in any direction. Now the different mine levels are used for transporting ore and waste to the surface, and you would use a railing system. So along those mine levels there's going to be some sort of railing system. Now whether that is a cart system that's pushed by hand, whether it's a railing system that is dragged or pulled with carts that are on wheels by small donkeys or horses or some other creature, or maybe you have an engine of some kind that pulls on them. Maybe people are pulling on these and using a rope connected to a crank. There's lots of different ways. Unfortunately, the movement of anything along the horizontal would still result in injuries because there's usually a tendency for there to be a slight tilt downward. And what could happen is if you used hemp rope, it would break, and then the cart would go out of control and then slam into your workers and kill them. So they eventually replace them with a metal or steel fibre rope, which is much stronger and doesn't break, certainly as long as it's looked after. The main mine levels These are the things you want your players to explore, okay? And they use these mine levels to explore and find, if they're building the mine for the purpose of digging out something, to find new veins of ore to dig out. And so that means there should be plenty of levels for your players and locations for your players to actually interact with. They would also backfill a production slope. Now, a production slope is where you find the ore vein, and this is to stop the ore from collapsing, because if you think about a bell shape underground, you're digging up the ground, and if you don't put some of it back, there's just a great huge hole with a whole lot of ground above, but there's nothing supporting it. So of course the whole mine can collapse in on itself if you're not careful. So your backfilling was quite important. So you would usually find something like that happening along the horizontal levels. Next, mine lifts. There's what's called the skip lift. It is used to move your ore, your mine, your dirt, your rock from the mine to the surface. And then there's the cage. Now the cage is for transporting the passengers. It allows them to, any kind of humanoid can be lifted up through there. It's pretty easy to operate. It's usually not complicated in any way. And it will, again, operate on the same shaft as the skip lift, which is where all your ore is going. You would also have a small bird or animal, canary, in the lift, in the cage, with people to help determine if there's enough oxygen to actually breathe as you would go down. Because if the bird died, then you knew that the small creature would not be able to survive, and if a small creature can't survive, then eventually a medium-sized creature or humanoid would not be able to breathe the air. So as soon as you see the bird die or in panicking, then you knew there was something wrong and it was time to go back up rather than continuing down. So it would not be uncommon for a canary to die in that small cage. And you may even find a canary in a cage that's been abandoned, that's perished, just the skeleton. Evil miners replace the small bird with pixies and fairies. I suppose you could do something like that, or even fey creatures. It's really up to you. It's your fantasy adventure. It's completely up to you. Okay, going back to the mine cart and tracks. Carts and a rail track, as I said, usually laid on the horizontal passageways coming off the main shaft or tunnels. And they allow, as I said, for the movement of ore and people. What I would suggest is, when you look at your carts, you need to decide what sort of system or technology is going to be utilised for operating them. As I said before, push carts, hand crank, steam engine, pulled by ponies, carried by a giant ant, I suppose. There's various ways you can do this. But if you don't have like a mining cart in your mine, you've done something wrong. It's something you don't want to leave out. Mines always have a sump. Now, what is a mine sump? It is the space, it's an open space below the main shaft, and it's there to collect water at the lowest level of the mine, because that's where water tends to go to. When the water drips down from above or it comes out of the ground, it goes to the lowest point, and so you need a space for that. So the sump stopped the mine from flooding at the lower levels. So so you would have your mine connected to an underwater stream potentially. And it's quite common for there to be underwater streams, rivers and lakes in the ground that you will not be aware of. So when they're digging, they would find these things and suddenly there's a rush of water. That's always a bad thing, because you cannot control what's going to happen inside the ground with a mine when suddenly you come across one of these things, because they literally are like underground rivers and lakes and so forth. So breaking into one of those is really bad, and that could flood a mine, cause all sorts of problems. But you would have to make sure something like that, if you found it and were able to control it, which is probably pretty unlikely, you need to feed it into the sump, and you probably need to leave the mine very quickly just in case it destabilizes. When it rains, the mine would fill up with water too, because of the main head frame. Water would actually go into there, but also water would leach into the ground and seep deeper and deeper and deeper, and it will go to the lowest point, and if there's a hole in the ground, that's where it wants to go. That's where water tends to travel to. So it can be a little bit overwhelming at times. So eventually the water sump would fill up and need to be emptied, so you need to have a pumping system. Now, how you decide to sort that out is up to you, but usually it's a series of pipes, and it's connected to an engine that would then suck it out. Now, in terms of fantasy, how do you do that? Magic. You can probably get away with doing magic. Magic will do the job. Okay, the mine production slope. I mentioned that before. This is basically the vein of ore that the miners are digging up. That's their resource. That's what they need. You're going to find various tools there, usually mines, picks, hammers, spades. You're going to have buckets as well. You can't always get your mining carts exactly where you're digging out because the tracks may not have been laid. So they would often have to fill something that was quite small that could be carried to the mining cart. So you probably want to have a few tools like that. Even something like a chisel might be found down there in terms of some of the tools the miners would use. You'd also need to have light sources. So anything that produced light that didn't produce a flame was great. Not always possible though. Okay, your monster populations in a mine. Where will they be? What are they like? Most of your monsters will live near the surface or at least close to the entrance or the main shafts, because the lower they go down, the more dangerous it is for them. So you need oxygen to breathe as a creature, but something like a golem or a construct would function as a great miner, and you could also position them in the mine much further down because they don't have to breathe air and they don't need to eat. So they don't need to worry about those sorts of things. And that's one of the primary issues, is being able to actually breathe in oxygen when you're in a mine. Also, undead would probably be living deeper down in a mine because they don't need to breathe and they can't drown. So you don't have to worry about those sorts of things. Again, golems don't need to worry about water as well because they can't drown either. Your mining living space. Living quarters and barracks would not usually be set up inside a mine. You would always have them above ground in tents or in some buildings because the mine is way too dangerous to live in. So you never put your living quarters inside the mine. Always in structures or tents above ground, okay? Dwarves and gnomes will probably have some sort of underground city or living space, but it would not be situated in the mine. It would be separate from that. Otherwise, it would be too difficult to survive. Too dangerous to work in the same space. You know, if you're working in the same space as you're living, it's way too dangerous, even for a dwarf or a gnome who are primarily living underground, correct? You have your mine pump station. I kind of mentioned this before. That is, you need to have a pump station somewhere. Now, your pump station can be situated inside the mine, but it's probably smarter to have a pump house or pump station above ground, because it would need to be, you need to have access to it, and you can't afford for your pump station, since it's going to pump water out of the mine, you can't afford it to be breaking down, and you can't afford it to wind up trapped or something collapsing on it. And mine collapses are quite common, so you definitely want to have something like that. Now, there's another thing that you can do to deal with oxygen, and that is the mine furnace. A furnace is quite dangerous, so anytime you try to have a furnace... Now, the reason for having a furnace deep into the mine is that if you burn, you can actually draw oxygen into the mine. This is one of these techniques they used. Quite clever, but also problematic because, one, it allows your... so oxygen is going to get burnt up by the fire. It will also draw oxygen down into the mine, but it also means if you have explosive gases and you have a furnace, explosion, everybody dies again. So pumping air down into the mine is probably the safest way to go. Now, there are a number of things that you can have as mine hazards and mine traps, and I suggest you just have a look at the things. When it comes to mine hazards, if it's a hazard that you would normally find in a cave system, it's probably going to work. But there are a couple of different hazards that you would have when you're dealing with a mine. I've kind of gone over them already before. Flammable gas, flooding, stuff like that. They're all going to be hazards that you would have associated with a mine. Now, when it comes to traps, if somebody's going to trap that location, putting traps in a mine is probably not required because it's such a dangerous location already. But if you're going to have traps, I would utilize things that are more natural in nature. So any kind of trap that you would associate with a cave can be associated again with a mine pretty easily without too much trouble. So that's everything I have for today on designing your own mine and how it should look and how it should be laid out. And hopefully this was useful to you. I want to thank my patrons who support me so I can keep doing this. Thank you very much. Thank you for watching. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.